All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's actually, I'm just standing here realizing that I don't stand in front of an audience of faces that I recognize, so many of you that I recognize all that often, except for teaching undergrad. So it's a real treat to present today. And I think these Reilly Forum are potentially really interesting approaches, and I encourage you, and I know I will, come to future events where we can hear interdisciplinary ideas, but also talk about them together. So this is my goal. I want to share some ideas with you and talk about sort of my take on a particular interdisciplinary topic, but I hope that won't take me very long. And then I would like to open it up for discussion, because I think in this subject area, pretty much everybody should have something to contribute from just about every discipline and perspective. And solving this problem and figuring out what path we want to go forward as a society really has no one person or no one way of thinking has a corner of the market. Alrighty, so let's all start on the same page though. Every good climate science talk starts with this graph, and I don't want to disappoint. This is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere for over the last 800,000 years. So here we are today, going backwards along the x-axis. And you actually see two kinds of climate change in this graph. The first is below the dotted line. The up and down and up and down and up and down of CO2 concentration, which is one of the most important greenhouse gases. So associated with these changes in CO2 concentration are changes in global average temperature. So global average temperature has, for the last 800,000 years or so, always been changing, up and down and up and down and up and down. And what are these wiggles? These are the ice ages, the comings and goings of the ice ages. So, before this dashed line represents a sort of pre-industrial period. I'm guessing this means Nigeria. So this is sort of natural climate change under this dashed line. Then we hit the Industrial Revolution and we started releasing CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that's when we crossed this line and we started going up rather dramatically. So that's the second kind of climate change in this graph, a kind caused by human emissions of greenhouse gases, and in this case, particularly CO2. So in this slide, let me point out that we entered the Industrial Revolution at the top of one of these wiggles, in the middle of an interglacial, so it's a nice warm climate that we have outside relative to the fluctuations that we have associated with the ice ages. And we were at about 280 parts per million of CO2. Now we're at about 390 parts per million. So actually we're a little higher than this blue dot. And these are our projected emissions. If we follow a sort of business as usual scenario, and I don't know if you read the newspaper, but we are following a business as usual scenario. Well, we may end up somewhere up here by the end of the century, say 900, which as you can see is fairly unique in the last 800,000 years. If we were to get our act together and start reducing our emissions, reducing and then ultimately stopping our emissions, we might end up something like here, say 550 parts per million. And these correspond to certain amounts of warming. Oops. So if we had this lower amount of emissions, we might get to something like 2 degrees C of warming by the end of the century. We're actually about halfway there already. Unfortunately, we're not halfway toward the lower emission scenario. And if we are unfortunate, we end up with CO2 concentrations like this, we might end up on the high end, something like 6 degrees C of warming. So what's 6 degrees C of warming? In fact, this is a world as different from today as today is from this world. So this is a little drawing of the maximum extent of the ice sheet during the last glacial maximum. So we were sitting under a big pile of ice. And everything that you see outside would have been ice. So all of the creatures and the trees and the plants and the bugs, they weren't here. They were pushed down into the southeast, and then as the ice receded, they moved back and recolonized areas that had been dominated by ice. So if you think about how different this world was from what we have now, this is kind of the amount of change that we're talking about within 100 years. This is about 15 to 18,000 years ago. So let's think about this amount of change, or how biology might think about it in a slightly different way. Let's imagine a spot. This is a picture of Death Valley in Southern California. So we all, maybe you've been there, or at least you've undoubtedly heard of this place. It's a desert. The things that live there are things that are adapted to hot and dry conditions, and pretty much not anything else. But during the peak of the last ice age, Death Valley looked like this. It was dominated by evergreen forests, and it had all of the vegetation and creatures associated with that type of climate. So my point here is, when you change the climate this amount, biology responds quite a bit. Species moved in and out of this large geographic area when the climate shifted, at least in the past. Now, unfortunately, and I can go back here, it's a little bit difficult. We can reconstruct what happened when the climate changed in the past. We don't know exactly what will happen when the climate changes in the future, so we can use the past to help us understand. We can also make models to help us examine what the future might look like as well. And I'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. So that's past biological responses to climate change, and sort of the amount of climate change we experienced in the past, and trying to relate it to the amount we might experience here in the next couple of decades. But let's also talk about how is biology responding to the climate change we've had so far. We've had about 3/4 of a degree C, or about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warming since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution already. So we can see biology. Is biology responding to that amount of change? It's kind of a small amount of what the models predict we might get, but we can see potentially if organisms are sensitive. So I'm going to show you a couple of things that we do see and that we predict for future responses. So one is that the seasons are changing, and this turns out that the last couple of weeks are a beautiful illustration of this. What we see is the arrival of spring has occurred steadily earlier over the last couple of decades, about 1 to 2 days earlier, which per decade, doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, we're just getting started in climate change, and we're seeing this sensitivity. And we measured this, for example, in North America, looking at the timing of lilac flowering. I don't know if you've noticed, but the lilacs are flowering now. So as we approach, you can imagine 2, 4, 6 degrees warming, how much this might affect the arrival of spring. It also affects things like bird migration. It affects the overlap of different species that have different timing, and therefore affects communities and community interactions. And we can see those responses already. Another thing we can see is species changing geography. So I just put a number up here. So where organisms live on Earth is already changing. And if you look at all the species that have moved, they're moving in the direction of climate change. They're moving upward in elevation and upward in latitude. On average, about 8 miles per decade, or about 40 feet per decade. Again, just in response to the amount of warming we've seen so far. So let's imagine what the world might look like from a biology point of view, say at the end of the century. So let's make a model and look forward. Then we can see species changing their geography like this. This is a tree that might be familiar, probably familiar to most of you. This is sugar maple. This is one of our dominant forest species. And on the left is a model that captures this sort of representation of where the species lives today. The dark colors represent the most likely locations where this thing occurs presently. And on the right, you have a modeled representation of where we think this species might live in the future. This is under one of a sort of moderately high scenario of climate change, and an average of a couple of different models. Now these models didn't capture Canada, so you kind of might imagine that this thing would be populating up here. But my point is to show you how much of the current distribution we predict will be uninhabitable for the species in the future. So if it could move into these new areas, it might occupy a new region. If it can't move, it might occupy just a smaller fraction of where it lives now. Or for some species, maybe not any fraction of its current distribution. instead of thinking about a species and imagining its geographic change, another thing you can do is you can look at a spot, or lots and lots of different spots, and watch the species move over it, or ask how does the composition of a location change under climate change. And there was a recent study published that examined this. It took a bunch of those kinds of models, like I just showed you for sugar maple, and then said, how does the composition, the species that live in a spot, turn over or change from the past, or the recent past to the future. And so these pixels show you for each spot the percentage change in vertebrate species in that location. So you can see that much of our North and South and Central America changes maybe about 30 to 40% change. So 30 to 40% of the vertebrate species in a spot being different than the ones in the past. And you can see some places like polar regions and high elevation areas where the turnover is much higher, the compositional change. So we're talking about a different world. By the end of this century, some have argued we'll essentially live in a different planet. Species will need to live in different locations. The climate will be different than it is today. We still can dictate how much different it is, a little bit different or a lot different, but it's going to be different. So I put this picture up here. I don't know how many of you have read this book. It's a popular book by Bill McKibben. He's had a lot of attention recently in the news. But he wrote this book called Earth. And his premise, he stuck an extra A in here to point out that it's not the old Earth, it's new Earth that we live in. And that's because of global warming, which I just discussed, but also think about the other factors that are changing. How much of the land area is dedicated to, say, agricultural production or urbanization. In the US, that's about 45% of our land area is in agriculture. And we have about 7 billion people, with projections from the UN to reach about 10 billion by the end of this century. So we have climate change, we have a lot of land that's not for nature conservation, and we have a lot of people with a lot of needs. So that will lead us to a very different planet. From a biology point of view, if we think about species responding to this climate change and the climate change interacting with these other global changes, what is it that we're worried about? So what? Species will change. The world will be different. Change in and of itself isn't particularly bad. It's the consequences of those changes. So we're concerned about the possibility of entire species going extinct. Species living in a place now where they can't live in the future and not being able to get to a new location where they could live in the future. We worry about the loss of genetic diversity or the loss of populations. For example, something like my example, sugar maple, if it shrunk to just a fraction of what it was before, it would have less genetic diversity. We might lose some of its distinctiveness across its range. And we worry about what I call ecosystem services, which is all the goodies that we get from nature. We worry about those being reduced, either because populations decline or fitness of some of those populations decline in a particular location. We're also worried about increases in invasive species or rise of new invasive species. So this is kind of stuff going down, and this is stuff coming up, if you will. And why should you care about species extinction or loss of genetic diversity or loss of ecosystem function? That's because ecosystems do things for us. We are completely and totally dependent upon them, whether it's for aesthetic and cultural reasons, for spiritual reasons, for actual production goods that we use, pollinating our crops, purifying our water and our air, for example. So these are the values that we're concerned about preserving. And I would argue that for this list of items, species extinction, population extinction, loss of ecosystem services, what we're concerned about is species not moving, not shifting, not finding the place where they could be in the future. A failure to adjust geographically. Let's focus on that. So in my research group, we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the processes that enable species to change geographically, to move to new locations, to track climatic change. And in what situations will those processes happen in the future, and what might constrain that process? Because where it's constrained, we could be worried about biodiversity loss. So how does a range shift, we call this, happen? I would argue can happen two ways. The first way is that sort of everybody across a species distribution picks up and moves, or a lot of everybody's. Some kind of systematic migration, like next year, lots of creatures set up their nests in a different location that's slightly cooler, for example. You can imagine this for, say, maybe some migratory birds or large vertebrates. But more commonly, I would argue, we're going to have population dynamics that are going to drive geographic range change. That means we're going to have in situ, what I call in situ change in population. So that means climate change will just affect the abundance of different populations across a species range. So some places might go down, and other places might go up. In principle, what ecologists expect to have happen is sort of a two-stage process. If a species shifts its range, we first expect that populations will build up at the edge of the species range in the direction of climate change. And you can think about that because if you think of a species as a well-mixed entity, then it kind of likes, you would expect it to be most fit under the climate that's sort of the center of its range. And as you move away from the edge, from that center out toward the edges, it's less and less and less of a good place to live until eventually you can't live there at all. That's the edge of your range. So under climate change, at least in one direction, if the conditions you like are coming your way, that's going to increase your populations in that particular edge. So where you were marginal, you suddenly become less marginal. And we call this peripheral enhancement. Peripheral enhancement is a good thing because it potentially builds up your army for poleward colonization, provides individuals that can march out and disperse and establish new populations, which actually enables your range to expand. So where these processes don't happen, you're either going to have slowed down or precluded geographic range change. Processes that sort of mess up range shifts. So we study these kinds of things. In particular, we've worked quite a bit on this concept of peripheral enhancement. And I'm just going to show you some sample kinds of things that we do. Not belaboring the data very much, but we do things like we conduct experiments. So for example, we look at a couple of different butterfly species, and we take them from the edge of their range and compare them to the center of their range, and we do things like translocation experiments where we take individuals, we expose them to different climates, and we ask, for example, what will these individuals at the edge of their range, what will they think? How will they do when we expose them under warmer conditions? And with experiments like this, we can also do things like, we can ask, will they do better under these central conditions, or are they actually adapted to their local conditions? Something we call local adaptation, which is the idea that peripheral populations might not be marginal at all. Maybe from some evolutionary adaptation, they like it out there just fine. And we do things like look at the genes that they express under an experiment like this. And this slide is most supposed to wow you with how complicated it is. So you can ooh and ah. But I can show you a plot like this, where each one of these dots on this slide represents what we think is a gene. And what we can study is, in this experimental setup, what genes get turned on and turned off in these different treatments, the different climates that we expose individuals to. In this graph, we're showing all the genes that do show that local adaptation, that different populations are using differently under different climates. So these are genes, for example, that peripheral individuals are using or expressing in a different way than individuals from the center of the species range. So these are genes that say, in this case, well, I like living in British Columbia just fine, thank you, even though the climate of my species is California in this particular map. My point here is that we have a variety of types of studies that show that there could be issues with this concept of how species shift their ranges, at least in some organisms. And then the one I just attempted to draw attention to is this concept of peripheral enhancement. We think there are reasons why there could be some species in some locations where you don't see this peripheral enhancement at all. And that's because species are actually adapted to the edge of their range, or populations are adapted to their edge of their range by evolutionary mechanisms. So if this is the case, if this is the type of biology that might cause species to change their geographic regions, and there might be issues with some of that, and that means that some species might not shift, well, now what? Well, we could walk away and we say, well, this species will decrease its distribution, or maybe it will go extinct, or some of the places that depend on that species where it might not occur in the future might lose some ecosystem services. So be it. Or we could think of it differently. We could try to do something. And doing something is what we call adaptation. So adaptation in the climate community has a fairly broad definition. It's all of the things that you would do to counteract the effects of climate change. Basically, all the things that you would do other than stopping greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, you should do those things too, but this is in addition to that. So it's an adjustment in either natural or human systems to sort of minimize their response to climate change, to help them. So an easy couple of things to think about would be like building seawalls to prevent destruction from storm surge and rising sea levels, or air conditioning public spaces to help people deal with heat waves and climate change, or breeding new crops that, for example, are more tolerant to drought conditions. Those would be all adaptations. So what I want to discuss with you is what are adaptations for ecosystems, for species, for creatures. These are mostly adaptations for people. And a lot of people spend time thinking about adaptations for people. But we're going to talk about adaptations for other organisms. I want to talk about 5. In fact, I want to talk about 4, because the last one's kind of obvious. And this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, and I'm going to give you a little example of each one. In fact, we need more than 5, so I'd love to know if anyone can think of more adaptation strategies, but these are the ones that are currently in the dialogue. And these are the ones that I am interested in struggling with. There are pros and cons ecologically, but also socially. So let me take you through a few of these. And so I call this adaptation for nature, as opposed to adaptation for people. So the first one is pretty straightforward. It would be great if it worked. Let's just do what we know how to do, more of it and better, and informed by climate change. So let's just do more and better conservation. So that would be things like weeding for invasive species, protecting native populations so they were as large and robust and healthy as possible so that they were prepared to deal with the effects of climate change. Setting aside more land, prioritizing or water or marine areas where we think there are species that are likely to be sensitive to climate change. And then designating those areas as new protected areas where we're going to, again, help species be robust and healthy ecosystems so that it can deal with climate change. So to show that as an example, this is a map of the National Park Service. So this is to the degree the National Park Service is already doing conservation. We know how to do these things. We know how to make populations healthy. We know how to set aside land. We would just do this way more in all places for lots of different organisms. We can come back and talk about what the pros and cons of some of these might be. Not surprisingly, a lot of ecologists like this idea. Another thing we might do is what I call strategic resistance. That is, we're going to go down fighting. We have a species of particular interest in a particular place. It's sensitive to climate change, but we're going to prevent those effects from being manifest. And an example that I like to use is the Joshua tree. So back to the desert Southwest. If you visited, you've probably seen this species. It's called the Joshua tree. The red areas in this map, this was a paper that came out recently, show you the current distribution of Joshua tree. And there's a Joshua Tree National Park, marked with an X over here. And in this paper, what they did is they modeled where will Joshua tree live in the future. And the red area, well actually the red areas are places where the Joshua tree lives now that they predict by the end of the century it won't be able to live. And so one of those red areas is the park. So you can imagine, I mean, it's the National Park Service. It's their job to preserve things. They have a kind of retrospective view of nature conservation. It's the name of the park. So maybe, and there is actually some evidence to suggest that it's actually hot and dry conditions affect the survivorship of seedlings. So maybe we could tend to Joshua trees in Joshua Tree National Park. We could water them, we could weed them, we could essentially garden Joshua trees to keep them in the park, even though otherwise they might diminish. It's difficult to imagine doing this for lots of species in lots of places, but you could imagine some species in some places where we might decide it's an important thing to do. Managed relocation is another example. This might be, well, many people have said this is the most controversial issue on the list. I agree, it's highly controversial. I might point out that some others on this list are controversial too. Managed relocation is the idea of moving things from where they used to occur to where they can occur in the future. So if we use Joshua Tree as an example, that's what the other colors are on this map from this paper. So the red areas are places where Joshua Tree lives now, where it's unlikely to live in the future. The yellow areas are areas where the model suggests it could live in the future, and it's close to a red area, meaning that maybe Joshua Tree itself could move and populate those areas through seed dispersal in this time frame. But you'll notice there's not so much yellow up there. So these authors said the green areas are also places where Joshua Tree could live by the end of the century, in the next several decades, but it's not likely to get there on its own. So these are candidate areas where you could put Joshua Tree. So you might ask yourself, is the yellow enough? Would we want some green? Where might we put it? And then suddenly you can also imagine, you can see, I love this picture because some of these are like Nevada test site. Maybe we could imagine doing a managed relocation program onto military land where maybe there aren't very many other uses there. I don't know. So managed relocation, putting things in new regions where we think they might live in the future in order to preserve them. Or for other reasons, like we want them to be there. Not just for preservation. Another idea is what we call corridors. And I put the word massive in front of that. Massive corridors. Corridors are a very straightforward idea for ecologists. We're very interested in corridors. We want to link up green spaces and protected areas so organisms can move between them for purposes of gene flow and maintaining healthy populations. Here we're talking about corridors that would let something migrate from Alabama to Michigan in response to climate change, because climate is the possible climate changes we're going to see are so large. So to illustrate this point, I have here a picture of our national refuge system. So you could imagine some sort of system we have in place. This is for land in some freshwater ecosystems. A system that we have in place where it's kind of distributed across the landscape. And maybe what we could do is strategically work on sort of linking these places up and building these huge corridors where organisms could move on their own. Essentially, this is an idea to overcome dispersal barriers. Reasons why, if a creature could move through native habitat, it might be able to move someplace. So let's put that native habitat in there as a way to help it move along. Now, you probably can imagine that one of the downsides of this massive corridor idea are the stuff that stands in the way. And as an illustration here, I put, you can't read this, but the darker the colors, the higher the percentage of acres in each square dedicated to corn production. So building corridors through the agricultural Midwest might be possible, but it's going to require quite a bit of creativity in land usage. And lastly, zoos and seed banks. This is kind of putting your organisms away for safe storage, maybe to pursue some of these things in the future. So especially if they're threatened with extinction in the wild. So which, if any of these, is the right thing to do? I don't have the answer to this question, even though this is the subject of my project that I'm working on in my book. Essentially, my argument is not that there are any of these that are the right choice. I'm arguing instead that thinking about these and carefully deliberating about them is the right thing to do. And I essentially lay out in this book that I'm writing what I think constitutes a rational and intelligent conversation about what is the right choice. These are the things that I think should be part of the dialogue. And I hope this can be the basis for a conversation with us today. So I essentially argue, and we can imagine more criteria, but this is sort of a rough outline of what I think is relevant to the decision about which of these, if any of them, we might ever pursue. First of all, there are, of course, technical and scientific considerations. Things like, what species should we consider doing adaptation for? And what species in which types of strategies? What are the side effects of some action that we might take? This is a very important component. And whether or not the action we might take might be actually effective in the first place. The side effects is critical because if there's one thing an ecologist knows is that we know nothing. And so we have to have, as ridiculous as in some senses this whole concept of adaptation, let me say that differently. To many ecologists, myself included, in some senses the concept of adaptation is a very foreign, kind of scary idea because it is a type of intervention. It invites the possibility of humans to tinker with nature for the benefit of nature or for the benefit of humans that depend on nature. And that's something that makes ecologists uncomfortable because we have many, many anecdotes of when we have intervened in the past unsuccessfully. I think the reason why ecologists, and myself included, are willing to discuss these topics is because we now have this new threat of climate change that is unprecedented and potentially very scary. So there is no choice of do nothing. There are accept the consequences of climate change or try to do something when it is appropriate. I would argue, well, a lot of the time people spend discussing these issues is focusing on the scientific technical issues. But I would argue, as a scientist, that the scientific issues are important, but not central to this discussion and debate. In fact, I don't think the scientists should be making many of these decisions, despite the fact that scientists probably think that scientists should be making those decisions. And that's because I think the ethical components, and I'll show you in a moment, the economic components are considerable. And these are social value discussions. And science is obviously terribly relevant to social value conversations, but scientists don't hold, again, the corner of the market on those discussions. So I think one of the central questions is whether or not climate change adaptation is justifiable, whether or not it's appropriate. And I call this in a sort of ethical dimension. And there are lots of different aspects to this ethical dimension, and I point out that we would have to decide what's justifiable in a pluralistic society. We do not all have the same value system about what things are good and what things are bad and what we want to preserve. But we do have some, I would argue, shared common framework, and we would have to build on that common framework. So I lay out, I think the key dimensions are to think about whether or not it's the consequences or the intentions that are important. And I think actually in this case we can draw on several examples in modern society, like the approval of new drugs and for guidance. I think it could be justifiable from our own self-interest and could be pursued as a government program via what ethicists would call a moral contract, that we sort of enter into taking collective action on behalf of our society. I also think that there might be reason to pursue adaptation when appropriate because of the ethical standing of nature itself, which has a kind of stewardship flavor to it as well. But not necessarily just because it benefits us, but because we're the ones who caused the problem in the first place. And lastly, I think there are key economic considerations. It sounds, in fact, one of the things I think is really compelling about the idea of adaptation is how it kind of turns the idea of mitigation, which is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, around. It seems very easy. Well, if nature is going to have a hard time adjusting to climate change, well, let's just do something to help it. That's like, if it's going to get hot, let's buy air conditioners. But as soon as you start thinking, well, who in the city of Chicago doesn't have an air conditioner? Why don't they have an air conditioner? How will we get them an air conditioner? How much will it cost to buy all those air conditioners? Suddenly, giving everyone an air conditioner doesn't seem quite so simple. And we can come back to the original cause of the problem, which is greenhouse gas emissions, which is actually, in some senses, is quite simple. So I think we can think about the economics of adaptation either in a cost-benefit type of framework, or we might think about it in a sort of cost-efficiency type of approach. So we might ask, what is the most effective, most helpful thing that we could do for the lowest cost, and prioritize our actions in that way. And then inevitably, as in all things ecological, when you start talking about economics, there's so much of what we might think about in terms of vulnerabilities to climate change that have non-market values. And I think this is actually a critical component. I can imagine, in fact, there are already people who are talking about pursuing climate change adaptation, like managed relocation, for species that have a market, that are economically important. So maybe in some instances we need to think about what are the guidelines under which we should restrict those activities or provide specific policy recommendations. And on the other hand, how do we encourage adaptation to happen when there isn't an industry looking out for it? So these, I think, are some of the key criteria which we should deliberate these questions, to ask which, if any, of these adaptation strategies are the right ones. And I'm going to leave you with, as a discussion point, and the members of the audience who are in my research group will have seen this picture before, and we had a long discussion about this picture. This is a photograph taken by Robert Park Harrison, an artist. This photograph is called Arbor Day. I don't know how well you can see it in the background. I love this photograph because I think it's tremendously inspirational, which seems strange when you first look at it. So this is an individual. He's come out to this area that's clear-cut. The sort of ecological circumstances here are not good. But, I don't know if you can see, but he's got ropes and sort of bandages, and he's piecing back together this tree, which seems ridiculously futile, which in many cases I think climate change adaptation can be, and in some senses legitimately is. Think about helping all of the species all around the world, everywhere that's potentially influenced by climate change. It seems kind of ridiculous. And it is. At the same time, the guy has come with a watering can, as if he has every expectation that after binding this tree together, he's going to water it and it's going to grow. And I guess I'd like to think that it will. And another thing we discussed is this landscape is so barren, and the problem is maybe so overwhelming. But what if a few other people came out here and helped bind trees back together and water them to grow? Maybe the problem wouldn't be quite so desperate. So I kind of see this as a little bit of an analogy for where we stand. That on the one hand is overwhelming, but on the other hand, if we dedicate ourselves to thinking thoughtfully about these ideas, maybe we can actually do something productive, even in the face of desperation. That's all I have to say, and I'm very interested to hear what you all have to say. Thank you. How do you want to do this? Okay. What's
going back to the hockey stick graph,
yes.
This is something I see a lot. These projections always stop at 2100.
Yeah.
I don't expect to live to see that here, but there are people alive today who have a reasonable expectation. And it's a little bit like you said, well, the models don't go to Canada, and of course we know about the drought in Texas, but nobody's heard about the drought in Mexico because our maps stop at the borders. So.
Yes.
So there's all sorts of ways in which we draw boundaries and then work backwards from that boundary, and you know, so we could get by until 2100 perhaps with some of these strategies. And yet what I don't see and what confuses me is, and it's not just you, I mean it's this sort of whole way of thinking, is what about 2200? What about 2500? What about 3000? I mean, in other words, it's like, I know it's not going to just plateau. And if it were, I mean, that would have consequences too. So it's kind of like, I mean, I'm a historian. I work at, you know, 2, 3, 500 year intervals with some comfort, and occasionally, you know, 2,000 to 3,000 year intervals with some discomfort, but it's sort of there. And so it's kind of like, you know, I instinctively think, like,
such a time short time.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, like a human lifetime is like quite a short span. So what happens when we project this out, and why aren't we projecting it out beyond a human lifespan?
Well, let me tell you why that is and what I think about it, and then I want to know what you think about it. So why do the models typically stop at 2100? You can run them longer. It's mostly a function of confidence. So what processes do we feel like we understand, and the longer term processes we are less confident about. We also, that's part, so part of it is the sort of climatic Earth process. But the other part of it is we don't know what those people are like. So it's quite hard, in fact, to project what the future climate will be like, even in 2100, because we don't know what we will be like in 2050. How much CO2 we're going to put into the atmosphere, for example. So, or maybe someone will come up with a really wonderful CO2 extraction system and concentrations will come down. So as we get further into the future, it's basically just modelers being reserved, conservative. Now, we do know what will happen in a sort of general sense, and that we put out a certain amount of CO2, and it takes a long time to equilibrate to that value, even if we just stuck a finite amount up there, not steadily increasing, but just put a certain amount in. And we know that the effects, the long-term effects of climate change, it will take a long time for those effects to be completely manifest. So when we say 6 degrees C by 2100 for this amount of CO2 emissions, that's not the amount of warming that those CO2 emissions will cause, it's just the amount they will cause by 2100. Actually, there will be quite a long lag, especially in things like sea level rise, because it takes the oceans a long time to reach a new thermal equilibrium, which will cause it to expand to make higher sea level. So it's even a little worse than you say that sometimes there are arguments about how much of it will be manifest by 2100, and then we even say, well, if it doesn't get here, if those effects don't get here by 2100, well, we just like don't worry about them, even though they will eventually come. So for example, sea level rise projections are for 2100. Well, wouldn't it be relevant to know, like, actually how much the sea level will rise when it's done rising? And that's actually a classic example, because a lot of the conversation was how much ice will melt in the short period of time versus a long period of time. And as we get more warming, there will be more ice melting over a longer horizon, more sea level rise. But we say, well, that'll happen a long time from now. So what do I think about it? I guess I tend to emphasize the short time horizon because I'm concerned about these and getting going in what we are going to do about the immediate effects. Does thinking about the long-term horizon change my perspective? Maybe, but I don't know if it makes me more willing to say, well, forget about it. There's nothing we can do. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, you know, it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's really complicated. Part of me thinks, I had a student ask me years ago, so if we all, just dropped over dead tomorrow, how long would it take the planet to kind of re-equilibrate? And I started thinking and started reading about it, and the answer is a very long time.
Some things very quickly, and other things very long.
Yeah, right. Depending on, but in terms of the extinctions and so forth, and you project it. So, there's a very, very, very long horizon of thinking too that's possible, and that's not where my mind goes. But on the other hand, where I was shell-shocked in 2007 when the Arctic ice melted down to that astonishingly small amount. And it's never truly reformed since. And I read last week that essentially, at least one researcher who's studying the Arctic ice says that the tipping point, multi-year ice is no longer forming, and so the tipping point for the Arctic ice is already upon us. We've already tipped the Arctic, and therefore, a lot of consequences will follow. And this, I was shell-shocked in 2007, not because it happened, but because I had been secure in the models that said this isn't expected to happen until maybe, for a while it was like 2050, right. 2060.
Right.
And then suddenly it was 2007 and I'm watching it. And so the caution of science is foundational and important. But sometimes I worry that the caution that says our models will only take us to 2100 and let's just sort of deal with the next little bit. And there's an imaginative gap that is the kind of gap that suddenly nature will fill with shocking things like 2007 and the Arctic ice years, and that leaves me feeling just profoundly uneasy with that kind of image. But it's complicated. I do not have solutions. I do not have an untangled and clear, non-despairing prescription for this.
I guess the more daunting the problem, the more I'm concerned that people are paralyzed by it and not willing to get on board. And that's not to say, that's not, and I don't make it, that's to make it sound as if there's like some sort of bandwagon that we all have to get on, and that's not what I mean. But I guess sometimes I think this problem, this 2100 problem, is sort of big enough in some senses. That's not to deny the longer term, and we shouldn't pretend like it's not there. But also, this isn't a problem for our children's children. This is a problem for our children. It's a problem for me, I hope, a little bit. Yeah.
Well, let me just offer one last thought, and I'll stop. And that is simply that another way to, you say it would induce despair to project a line out. I actually find it a hopeful thought.
Okay.
Because if you say, well, our difference, what we can do today won't make a lot of difference in the first few years or in the first few decades.
Yes.
But my gosh, you start thinking what actions we can take in the next few years or few decades that will have profound effect in 3 or 4 centuries. Might make all the difference between a habitable planet, a planet that cannot be inhabited. You know, then it's like, all right, let's get on the barricades, figure it out, because I want a livable world in 2500. And so oddly, I have the opposite reaction.
Okay. There are undoubtedly tipping points that if we could, not necessarily problems that we need to necessarily solve and get everything in sort of their neat and tidy spot, but if there are systems in which we can help them overcome some critical tipping point, then
I don't know what it would be, but I mean, basically, I was moved many years ago when I first met Wes Jackson by hearing him talk about an agriculture for the 22nd century.
Right.
And it's that kind of, forget about thinking in terms of a century. The real liberation is when we say, okay, no, we're going to go for the big problems for the long term. And then suddenly you're not limited to Copenhagen solutions or Kyoto problematics, but you were emboldened. That's what I mean about imagination. Thinking geologically, not just in the political horizon.
Thanks, Jessica. You mapped out a very clear picture for us. I suppose it's with my biology hat on now to some extent. I'm interested in how you choose the species that you might think about moving, if you are moving the species, because even identifying, we haven't even begun to identify the multiple species that exist. And so in a sense, there's a double choice. First of all, we've selected the ones that we're going to identify, and then we select again which ones we're going to choose to move. And you showed some examples of the sugar maple and things, but these trees take hundreds of years or many years to grow, and by the time they've grown, the climate will have changed again. So it's like a sort of moving target. So I just wondered how or who's involved in the judgment call, as it were, to make those selections. I'm very interested in how decisions are made in communities and that kind of thing. And so it's, in a sense, it's to do with the limitation of the knowledge of the science and the lack of maybe there aren't enough ecologists, working in the field to get to map the process. There's such an enormous gap, and we regularly see species going from threatened to endangered to critically endangered to extinct, and you know, where do we intervene? In what stage do we start to intervene in the red data collection, for example? In addition to that, I suppose it comes back to this idea of time scale. You know, are the green blotches on the map that you showed us the predicted habitable zone, say in 100 years' time, or do we sort of overcompensate a bit to allow for this ongoing lag? So I just find all those questions really interesting, and just wonder whether you had any thoughts as someone who's actually actively involved in this field yourself.
I do. So as for choosing species, we have worked, in fact, there's a student from the former student in the back, Jill, who we have worked a little bit on comparing different species in terms of their risk of causing side effects in the idea of removing species. A concern is creating invasives. Well, we have a lot of information on invasion and what kinds of traits are associated with invasion, so we can potentially quantify where, what would be the riskiest scenario and the sort of least risky scenario. I think that's relevant. There are also tools that are being developed, and my postdoc James is studying one of these, where we're actually looking at vulnerability. So another key question is, we need to make a list of all the species that we think are most at risk from climate change, and what factors determine their vulnerability. And that would be a key component to the decision. I guess one of the reasons I have been emphasizing the sort of social, the ethical and economic side of things as well too, is because I don't know quite as, so our scientific knowledge may be imperfect on things like vulnerability and risk. Even our models are imperfect about the time horizon. Maybe we don't know the exact place to put it. Maybe we'll have to put it multiple times. But I guess I still see those things in principle as either quantifiable, or we could build a model that would allow us to explore a range of different possibilities. I just reviewed a paper actually yesterday of a model that does exactly that, that calculates the optimal location for movement of species over different time horizons. I don't know how we're going to make decisions about things like desirability of species. And one of my biggest critiques about managed relocation, for example, and there are lots of people who criticize managed relocation for lots of good reasons. My personal take on that is I think it's inadequate. And for the reasons you say about we don't even know, we only know a fraction of biodiversity and then we're going to save it by moving it. I think it's not going to, no one's going to be looking out for the creepy crawlies of the world, if you will, and I say that as an entomologist. But at the same time, I can imagine that for economic reasons, there will be quite a large incentive to be doing some of these things. And I don't think it will be based on vulnerability. I don't think it will be based necessarily on what is the risk of side effects. And I don't think it'll be based on what's the right location to put them and over what time horizon. Because we could take seeds of trees and we could sprinkle them everywhere. We could do that every 5 years and they'll just, they'll take wherever the climate is suitable to take. And the justification is because they want to grow them to cut them down to build houses. So I'm just sort of equally concerned. And I don't, maybe it's because I am a biologist and I come into that domain less familiar or comfortable. I don't know how I'm going to take that and put it in my models of invasion risk and probability of colonization and those other things, which I agree with you are tremendously interesting, and we work on them.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what you're saying is that in the end, the utilitarian ethic will trump, which is, in terms of the economic, understood in economic terms, and that is somewhat depressing. And so I suppose, in a sense, how do we guard against biologists being used by the politicians and the economic? In other words, you could be put under economic pressure to find out, species which have particular economic value and do the research around that. And so in other words, universities could be pushed in that direction as well, to just concentrate on those species that have a particular economic.
Well, I think we, to a certain degree, we already are, but yes, in fact, sometimes when talking about adaptation for ecosystems, there are some people who would say we shouldn't discuss any of this because it is tinkering with nature and that always leads to bad consequences.
one of the reasons to discuss this is not necessarily is not an advocacy of we need to do this in situations this, and this, but actually the flip side of that there could be, and there already are, instances of people who are ready and eager, and we might need guidelines and principles that would prevent some of those activities, or at least impose some criteria, some decision-making criteria. So I don't know that we're necessarily going to be all pulled into, making decisions for timber companies, but I do think that the reality, especially in this country, of how we make decisions and the significance of economic values is important in this conversation. And I think it's important also that we talk about the consequences of climate change, so because it's going to be the collective that decides what's going to happen to all the other things that do not have an economic importance.
Of course, if the politicians are in climate change denial, then in a sense it's the other side of the coin.
Another side benefit of talking about this topic, which maybe isn't important for this presentation today, but it's a little refreshing to be talking about what to do under climate change. Obviously, I still spend a lot of time talking about the importance of preventing climate change and stopping climate change from happening. But in some senses, this actually can have a broader audience, and you don't necessarily have to buy the whole political mumbo jumbo to start thinking about management, if that makes sense. But that's such a problem for another day. I do wish we could do something. Actually, I think at Notre Dame we ought to be able to do something to depoliticize climate change and climate science in general. I think it's crazy that science is so, it doesn't have a party affiliation. It's ridiculous. Yet it seems that it does.
I just wanted to, so first of all, I'm an interloper. I'm an ecologist as well, and I'm not here at Notre Dame with the University of Washington. Yana can go as flowers. But I just wanted to follow up on one comment you made, and I think one of the reasons that scientists as well as politicians end up falling back on sort of ecosystem services, which in the end comes down to what's economically valuable to us, is in terms of thinking about adaptation to climate change, is science can't actually tell what is good and bad in terms of the changes. That's not something that science can actually tell us what's good and bad. We can help devise scientific strategies for achieving a certain goal, like having a functioning wetland or moving, translocating a species. But science can't actually tell you what the right thing to manage for is. So I think that's actually part of that's part of what makes it challenging. And in some ways, so my family, my parents live in the Netherlands, and I think in many cases issues of conservation are often easier in Western Europe because their landscape is so trashed by humans. There's no mythology that there isn't a part of the Netherlands that isn't influenced by humans. So when a lot of money, for example, gets given to a province and they decide to restore something, they take a look at it and they say, oh, we have a rare orchid species that needs a home, so we'll create a home for it here. I feel like in the US there'd be a lot of self-torturing about whether the orchid ever occurred there before. And so, I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but I think to some extent maybe we have to be a little bit pragmatic and make decisions about what we're managing for. And I think it's okay in many cases if we're managing for economically valuable, so I live out west, and if we're managing for economically valuable timber species, then we're actually managing for old growth forests.
Or salmon.
Which is good for a lot of the species that come along with it. But I don't know that I feel comfortable as a scientist. I can project changes, but I don't know that I feel comfortable as a scientist telling you what's a good change or a bad change. I mean, that's kind of a value judgment.
Yeah, but I also think that if scientists choose to align themselves with, say, in a particular industry, they are making a value judgment as citizens. They may not. In other words, I think to assume that scientists don't have any sort of moral responsibility to think about some of the consequences of what they're doing in terms of their skills, as it were, being used to promote a particular courses of events. So in other words, I do think that scientists are also citizens, and you can't. It's very easy for scientists to say, oh well, the value judgment is not up to me. But this is the process through which we need to to enable this to happen, but you're part of that, and you could say the same for the physicists who generated the nuclear bomb could equally have said, oh, well, it's not really my responsibility, but then, you know, society has to judge whether to use this thing. Do you see what I mean? So I think that the potential of science, for good or ill, is enormous, and I do think that scientists need to grapple with
No,
that.
and I didn't mean to imply that we don't have a responsibility, but I think if you ask most scientists, like I would say, I would want to maintain a ecosystem that has that functions like another like a healthy ecosystem, and I could have some definitions for that. And maybe I want to preserve biodiversity, but I think there's going to be a lot of other things on the table, and as long as you have something that you're managing towards. But I don't know that my definition of what's a healthy ecosystem or what I would want to manage towards it's not going to be what everybody else wants to manage towards.
I mean, well, part of the problem is knowing which particular ecosystem, what the baseline is, and, you know, there are discussions about restoration and so on and that, so where historically you put the baseline, and in Europe, as you say, the baseline has more or less disappeared, because it happened so long ago, but I think sort of the fallback position to say that we as it were, fall back to just the economic benefits and rather somewhat truncated in terms of the goal. And I don't, maybe Jeff's going to something.
Well, I was just going to, we can move on, but I was just going to say, I completely agree with Jannica that this is why I sort of delineated these are the science issues, these are the ethical issues, these are the economic issues. I think we must be careful about what science can tell us and what it can't. But I also agree with you, Celia, that doesn't mean that scientists shouldn't be participating in that conversation about the values and the economics. And I think that all that science, in my opinion, what science has to offer is the cards it can lay on the table. This is what can happen. This is what you could do. And then I agree scientists also need to be part of that larger social conversation about what we should do. But I would also say that's not part of science, but science is important to it. You know, I would somehow want to keep them separate, but I want to make them tremendously important to one another. If that makes sense. We'll go. Seeing hands in the back. Yeah.
Okay. So my question is about the models and modeling. So
models and modeling?
Models and modeling. So
okay.
I'm a historian of physics, so I kind of vaguely have an idea about how people model the climate, and you do a net of points, and you do differentials, and you do flows, and you do projections based on that, and run this through big computer systems. And some historians of physics describe that a bit, and how there are these three different main groups, and they can kind of get divergences, but they compare their models, and they kind of come to some kind of coherence. And so you could have the groups come together and say to the Bush administration, well, actually there is some consensus eventually.
Right.
But my question is, so in your case of modeling, when you refer to modeling and models, and what might, I don't really have a good sense of what that can be, and whether, for example, it's relevant to this discussion that we were just having, that you were just having, about what role the scientists should play, because if you lack a consensus on those models, then we have the thing that Naomi Oreskes talks about exactly in this and other cases, where you can get people to align their work with some interests. And maybe it's always like that, but especially so as I imagine it's very difficult to guess what's going to happen to a species in an environment, in an ecosystem especially.
Well, if Jason McLaughlin is sitting next to you, he's probably jumping out of his seat at this. I don't know what happened. Oh, yeah, I think she probably. Okay, models. If you are a modeler, or if you're a scientist, you understand, or a historian of science, you understand what a model is for. Ed understands what a model is for, and what it's not for. And our climate models are spectacular. They do an amazing job of capturing
how the world works at some sort of mesoscale kind of way. And they capture reality. It's the way, it really is the way the world works. That's largely why they can agree, because they all can agree that on basic fundamental Earth system processes, which are in those models. Now they all disagree because they're all taking slightly different abstractions of that reality. So they all agree on the reality, but they all get slightly different predictions. So then they come together and they make these things called ensemble models, which is like the average of all of their own models, which is good. And we can see that the ensemble is actually quite similar to each individual model. And they, if you squint your eyes, they're really all fundamentally the same because they're all based on the same reality. The ensemble models, though, do have a policy problem, and that is that it trends our attention toward the average of those models. It could actually be that one model is a better abstraction of reality than another model, and maybe that's the more conservative model, or maybe that's the more aggressive model. So we kind of, when we talk about these let's all get along kind of thing, we tend to ignore the possibility that someone is more right than somebody else. So it's useful for us to say, look, our models are all basically the same, but we still need to think about what the details of those models are. And that's the kind of nuance I think that people who don't work with models don't get. Like, they think the model tells us like the way it's going to be. And it was never, in some sense, it's not really designed, it's kind of designed to do that, but not really designed to do that, right? Now, the reason why I say Jason is jumping out of the seat is because ecological models, in comparison to climate models, are pathetic. Really, really, really bad. For lots of good reasons. Ecology, you could argue, is in some sense it's more complicated than, like, you know, the thermal inertia of the ocean. I don't know. But maybe climate scientists have been at it for a longer period of time. They have the history of lots of sophisticated weather models and things like this. These models are statistical. They're simply a manifestation. So these are, you have to start with this current model. You take all the occupancy points where that species currently lives, and you basically make a big correlation with all the climate variables associated with those occupancy points. And then you take a climate model and you just map where do those, we call it an envelope, where does that envelope, those climate variables that constitute the current distribution, where are they in the future? And you just put them as colors on a map. That makes all kinds of assumptions about why things live where they live. Now, at the surface, we believe it. It's true. You know, things like it in a certain climate. I mean, it's definitely the case that sugar maple lives in a certain climate, and if the climate changes, it's not going to live in those places anymore. So on the sort of, again, we can all kind of agree that this is an appropriate thing to do, but it really falls apart in this, and I wanted to show this because one of the problems that ecologists have is that we make maps, the same thing in the climate community. And what does a map invite you to do? A map invites you to look at a spot. So you might imagine on this map, who are people who are looking at this map? People in Vermont are looking at this map, who have this little cottage industry in sugar maple syrup. So they're saying, oh no, in my farm, you know, am I going to be able to grow, is there going to be sugar maple? But the model really can't do that. It can't tell you, it's taking an abstraction. And I think this is a really, really important part of where the public and scientists don't communicate well with one another. Because we can actually live with the fact that our models are wrong. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But to the public, it's like either it tells me how it is or it's not right. And I think it would be wonderful, and I think historians of science could really, and already are teaching us how to better explain that to people. But these models are not nearly as fancy as the global circulation models are. But still, at some level, we kind of believe them in the sense that it shows us that a species lives in a place and it will live in a different place. But we don't believe in the predictive power of them.
Yeah, thank you for a positive thought. You limited reasonably your talk to specific geographical zone,
Yeah.
States. But as is mentioned in the title of talk is the human's problem. It's the matter of humanity. I want to ask you, as a scientist who's active in this field, how much scientists are concerned about the climate change in a broader geographical sense? How about Maldives, which might disappear? How about Africa, which is the governments? There is no scientist to work on this field. If there is scientists, there is no money to pay fund for that. If there is money, there is no government concerned about the climate change. And how about these countries? How about the undeveloped and developing countries? Is there any serious scientific research in course of action about these countries, or it's just limited to developing countries?
That's an excellent question. You're right. You're right to notice, and it's purposeful on my part to focus on North America for a couple of reasons. One is especially if we were to be friendly with the Canadians, we kind of have the continent to ourselves. In a lot of other parts of the world, you have more political boundaries, which adds more complications. In terms of where it leads you to envision a lot more cooperation. It's kind of more intuitive in North America to think about large things in space. So you're absolutely right. We also have a large scientific literature, so I can have lots of anecdotes to sort of make points. And another reason is my argument about deliberating these points, like these are the things that I think are important to the social conversation. In my mind, they work best in a sort of pluralistic democracy. It works in a place where we actually all do get to sit around and think about what we think is the right thing to do. And that doesn't apply to all parts of the world. That said, the issues do apply in all parts of the world. And I don't mean to say that they don't. And I do think that there are scientists everywhere tremendously concerned about these issues. Now, the political will and the political power and the financial resources to do things is a significant problem. I think, though, that you could actually turn that around, much like we were talking about timber companies, though, and you could also be concerned about the potential for people to exploit those. That there's no one to look out for what is in the public interest. There's no one to necessarily prevent somebody from doing something either, which might end up having harmful side effects. I shouldn't say no one. There isn't as much political infrastructure, perhaps, in some countries. But you also can imagine other places where action can be taken quite readily. I mean, if you look at someplace like China, which is going to experience, in many locations, pretty profound effects of climate change. They don't seem terribly interested in changing their economy to reduce greenhouse gases. So there's a lot of conversation among Chinese scientists and Chinese sort of bureaucrats about what are we going to do? So we're going to have to do adaptation, so what are we going to do? And in many cases, they have a political infrastructure that they can decide what to do, and then they would do it. So I think it is terribly relevant in places like that. I just, in the scope of what in this book I'm working on, it's a little bit too complicated. But it helps me by having more geography. Do we need to be out in other places thinking about these issues? Absolutely. And this is something that's plagued conservation biology forever. Right, and and all you need to do is think about the tropics. I mean, what are we going to do with the tropics? That's where all the species are. I don't know.
One last question.
Does Don get the last question?
I hope
not.
There's so many questions here, things that are wonderful things to think about. For example, the question about whether scientists have a role to play, and if so, what kind of role in setting the values agenda. Well, this idea that that's not the case. I mean, that's itself very a historical construction in very specific circumstances. It's a product of a certain moment in modernity, and there's a huge literature among philosophers and historians of science right now re-examining that set of assumptions. Why do we believe that? Should we believe that? Is there some role for the scientists to play? That's a big topic of discussion right now. Another thing to think about here is, you said quickly a moment ago, you think this conversation works best in a liberal democracy. I'm a liberal Democrat, but I'm not sure that's true necessarily.
I'm not sure action is necessarily.
Well, I'm not even sure that the deliberative processes necessarily always work best. And again, as a historian, I want to put on my historian's hat, and I want to ask, why did we come to think that, right? Under what sorts of circumstances did we come to believe that? And has the world changed in ways that make some of those assumptions maybe no longer relevant? But,
So what are you thinking about as an alternative, like some sort of technocratic kind of expert-based, where?
Well, I don't have a view of my own here. I'm just saying that we need to problematize those assumptions, right? All of those assumptions are themselves products of very specific historical circumstances, and some of the decisions we made back in the 19th century and the 18th century might still today be the right decisions to make, but some of them might not be. And so you mentioned the Chinese example. I'm glad that you did, because here's this very curious mixture of an authoritarian political structure and market mechanisms in the economy. I think it's going to be an interesting experiment to see how a system like that responds to challenges like this. And I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but it's surely different enough so that it's going to be an interesting experiment to see how that works out. But like I said, one question I really wanted to ask, and I want to go back to the climate models. Many times there was talk about equilibration, re-equilibration. There's this trope of equilibrium that's running around in this discussion as if that's some sort of default background to which we want to revert, or we want to tune all of our conversation to a rhetoric of equilibrium. There's something really wrong there, because you look at your temperature chart and you look at the shape of that chart. There is no equilibrium in a global system with that kind of input.
Equilibrium in the long term.
From the point where we are going forward, there is no equilibrium. You can't maintain equilibrium with that kind of input in one of your strongest independent variables in the system. I think we need to readjust the way we think about this. I think the modelers need to readjust the way they think about it. I think the idea of re-equilibration it's not part of the future that we're facing. We're facing a new kind of dynamic system here, and I don't know that we even have the mathematical tools for understanding how those kinds of systems work. But I'm equally interested in the rhetoric here, just the sort of fetishizing of equilibrium, as if somehow we think in those terms, now we're comfortable, we're cool, right? Again, that's a historical artifact.
It's a mathematical artifact too, but which is also historical, right? I mean, this is a system of a couple differential equations, and we think about pumping 1 unit of CO2, and then we say, to what new equilibrium does it reach? But even though we're pumping in so much that the equilibrium concept itself doesn't ever get realized. Ecologists actually don't really believe in equilibrium anyway. So maybe I am picking up on this sort of discourse of the climate. And maybe really what adaptation is going to be is a constant sort of ball juggling exercise. And there will definitely be balls that get dropped. The question is which balls to juggle and how to do it and that kind of thing. I'd really be interested to hear what other kinds of ways that you think. I guess on the sort of pluralistic democracy and rational decision making, I recognize that this is a fairly modern construct and something that we're taught as school children to, right? Those of us who sort of grew up in the Cold War, we were really especially taught that this was just the ultimate way of being. And as scientists, we are taught that this is how you come to the right answer, is just by deliberating about it. So I guess I do in my heart of hearts believe that, but I also recognize that it's not necessarily the best way to make a decision, in the sense that if there is some sort of optimal right answer, you won't necessarily reach it. And I also recognize that it's not the most rapid way to make a decision. And I've always been taught that everybody's voice gets heard, and maybe that's not necessarily needs to be the case. Maybe there are actually some voices that are more important than other voices.
So one way I jokingly made that point in this very context is, I'm not sure Joe the plumber deserves a seat at the table in this conversation. If I have to choose who I'm going to put in the room, I'm not sure Joe the plumber is the first guy.
Well,
Jason's going to
I'm just joking about that. I think scientists are uniquely trained to be bad at ethical decision making about management problems like this. When we see a problem, we always start by saying, well, okay, let's imagine an infinitely flat plane and everything else is, and we have all these homogeneous dots just moving at random. We always start there. And then, you know, we maybe have to add in some things to make the model more complex, but we keep the simplest possible model. I think that there's a whole lot of the ways that we're trained to do good science that actually make us especially bad at being in the room for some of the ethical implications of what our science implies. So, I mean, I'm no fan of Joe the plumber, but in some ways, if you think of that sort of populist rhetoric that he may represent, or he claims to represent on TV, he may have some insights that scientists would never come to, and they might, but I don't necessarily trust the scientists more.
I'll have to show you sometime. We have a survey that we sent out to thousands of the colleges asking their opinions about mandatory relocation. We also asked their opinions on lots of things sort of around and associated with it. It was pretty interesting what they think, not only just about the scientific issues, but some of the ethical considerations as well. They're pretty uniform in their perspective on these.
Yeah.
Not uniform on their perspective on science, but very uniform in their demographic and sort of other beliefs.
So I want to thank Jessica once again for the talk and discussion. So if you'll help me to thank her.